Welcome to the Jews for Judaism monthly webinar. This evening's topic is revelations about the revelation at Sinai. We're going to speak about the upcoming holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So we want to explore, what is the significance of this? Did it really happen? Was it an event that truly affected us spiritually, and how is it relevant to us today? The story starts with the Jews being enslaved in Egypt. For years, Moses approached Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," in the same way that our leaders spoke to the Soviet Union and begged, "Let our people go from the slavery of being entrapped in the Soviet Union." So Moses said, "Let my people go from the slavery that was going on in Egypt." But was it simply a freedom from slavery, or was it something greater? Well, if we look in the Torah, we see that in addition to saying, "Let my people go," the next part of the verse says, "Let my people go so that they may serve God." It wasn't simply enough to be free. It wasn't enough to no longer be under the bondage of the taskmasters in Egypt. The purpose of this exodus was to reach a point where the Jews would experience a revelation at Mount Sinai. They understood where they were going. And in fact, this was such an amazing event that when God approached Moses at the burning bush and gave him the mission of helping the Jews and leading the Jews out of Egypt, Moses wondered, how could you choose me? Why am I qualified to take the Jews out? How will they even believe me? What could I do to prove it to them? And the answer that God gave Moses was amazing. He did not tell Moses that when you perform the miracles of turning the Nile into blood, or bringing frogs over the land, or bringing darkness, or even the death of the firstborn in Egypt, none of those miracles would be the conclusive proof that Moses had been sent by God. The only proof that would be acceptable is the completion of the mission. When the Jews would arrive at Mount Sinai and experience a divine revelation of godliness at that moment, where everyone perceived that this was God. It was a national revelation. It wasn't one person or two people or three people. It was over 600,000 men and children, and even more women, totaling close to 2 million people who gathered at Mount Sinai and shared in this revelation. That's so powerful an event. That is what has made Moses the greatest of all prophets to the Jewish people to this day. Now, the amount of time that passed from once they left Egypt until they received the Torah was 7 complete weeks, 49 days. And that's why this holiday that's coming up next week to commemorate the giving of the Torah is called Shavuot. This is the plural way of saying the word Shavuot, which means week. So Shavuot means weeks, commemorating the 7-week time period between the exodus of Egypt and the revelation at Mount Sinai. And each day was a moment for the Jews to draw closer and closer to that spiritual event. Now, something happened very interesting. It's hinted in the writings of our rabbis based on a passage in the writings of King Solomon. In King Solomon's writing, he mentions that when God came to give the Torah, he said, "I came, but you're not here." Well, how can God say that? How do we say that God came and the Jews weren't there? We know they were at Mount Sinai. So our sages explain, based on our oral tradition, that the eve before the giving of the Torah, rather than stay up in expectation, the way a young child would stay if they knew that their father was coming home from military service and he couldn't go to sleep. The Jews went to sleep. They chose to go to sleep. And when God came at that moment to give the Torah and found the Jews sleeping, his statement was, I'm here, but where are you? Why are you sleeping? Now our sages continue to explain that what happened was when they slept, a miracle occurred. That nothing in the desert disturbed them. Not even mosquitoes biting them. And they went to sleep for a reason. This helps us also understand the preparation for Mount Sinai. Each day of the 49 days approaching Shavuot, the Jewish people were looking inside themselves, looking at an aspect of themselves that they could refine, an aspect that they could rectify, so that when they finally would receive the Torah, they would be pure. For 49 days, they eradicated the evil influences of Egypt, the idolatry, the foreign ways of the Egyptians. And they brought themselves closer to purity. On that 49th day, they had done everything physically possible. They thought that since something spiritual happens when a person sleeps, a part of their soul leaves their body. And we know this from the fact that many times if a person has a question that they can't think of the answer of, they say, let me sleep on it. And it isn't simply because their mind is refreshed. Sometimes an idea comes to them in their sleep and they wake up with the answer. They're not refreshed and they can think through the process and then they come with the answer. They awaken with the answer. And that's because a 60th of their soul goes up to heaven while they're asleep. They experience a 60th of death, and that soul returns back to the body with that answer. So the Jews mistakenly thought that by going to sleep before the giving of the Torah, their souls would go to a higher plane. And in that higher plane, they would receive even further purification to receive the Torah. And that's why even the mosquitoes didn't bother them. They had reached, in fact, such a high level of holiness that even the physical world didn't interfere with what they were doing. So why was God upset at them? This should have been something that God was proud of. He should have heralded it as a wonderful deed. He was upset because the Torah is not meant to be in heaven. The Torah is meant to be received and practiced in this physical world, not by escaping it. If we thought that it was about escaping it, then suicide cults that tell us that the way to get close to God is by committing suicide would be the rave in Judaism. But it's the opposite. The idea is to be in this world. So we have to understand that reaching this moment of Shavuot is a process. It's removing the Egypt from our lives. A great rabbi once said, it's easier to take the Jew out of Egypt than to take the Egypt out of the Jew. And that's what they were doing. When they finally reached that state at Mount Sinai, and they were prepared to get the Torah, something unbelievable happened. A revelation of godliness that was unquestionable. Something that today is hard for us to imagine. There was such an amount of revelation of godliness that things transcended time and space. Interestingly, the Torah says that the mountain was surrounded with lightning and thunder. But when it describes how the Jews experienced that, it says they heard the lightning and they saw the thunder. They saw what is supposed to be heard, and they heard what is supposed to be seen. To simply say that that was a scribal error is really ridiculous, because it's such a simple thing to correct. But for centuries that was part of the Torah and remains part of the Torah, because it represents that their senses and what they were experiencing were beyond the realm of nature. In fact, when God spoke and the Jews heard his voice, there was no echo. It didn't bounce off of the mountains that were near Mount Sinai. It permeated them. Because the idea of a godly revelation in this world isn't that it stays up in heaven, but it comes down into this world and it affects and changes this world. And we become God's emissaries in this mission of revealing godliness in this physical world by practicing and keeping the Torah. Now that seems like an amazing act on our part that would take tremendous power. And a person could become very egotistical about it and think, wow, look at how great I am. But in the midst of this mission, we are meant to remain humble. Moses was the epitome of humility. But that we should be humble is represented by the choice of Mount Sinai. In the midst of a desert, a flat desert, was this mountain. A mountain does not represent humility. It represents arrogance. It's reaching up high to the sky. But of all the mountains within the desert, Sinai was not the highest. It was one of the lower mountains, representing that although we have a lofty mission of reaching up to God and receiving the Torah and bringing it to this world, we have to remember our humility. This idea of the Jews reaching up to God and God reaching down to us and sharing the Torah with us is symbolized in the Jewish star. If you look at the Star of David, which is two triangles, one has a base and is pointing up. This represents the Jewish mission of reaching up to receive something holy from God. And the arrow that points down is the concept of us bringing it down into this world. The Torah was given to transform us. We know that the Jews were in the desert for 40 years before they could enter the land of Israel. We know that the flood that took place in the time of Noah lasted 40 days and 40 nights. We know that Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days. And we know that the size of a mikveh that a person goes into and it transforms them from a state of spiritual impurity to a state of spiritual purity is 40 saw, a biblical measurement, also based on the number 40. So we have 40 days on Mount Sinai, 40 years in the desert, 40 days of the flood, and 40 measurements of water in the mikveh. 40 represents in all of these cases transformation. So Mount Sinai was meant to transform us from being solely in the physical world, not seeing the spirituality, to taking the physical world and seeing the spirituality in it and returning it back to God through our service and our mission of keeping Torah and mitzvahs. When the Jews received the Torah, we always speak about how they received the 10 commandments. That was the main divine revelation at that moment. The stories of the Torah, the later events that took place after Mount Sinai were recorded later. But those 10 commandments contain much more. In fact, they're really 10 statements that contain, in fact, more than 10 commandments. And the Torah is complete with 613 commandments. And like I've mentioned many times, 613 may sound like an overwhelmingly large number of precepts to do. But if you look on the civil laws of any city, or any state, or any country, and you look at how many laws are on the book, we're talking tens of thousands of laws. But what is the purpose of a law if not to transform and make society better? To control our impulses, to create calm from chaos. If we didn't have any traffic laws, driving to the store would be a disaster. But because we're told don't go through a red light and don't speed, and it restricts us, if we understand the purpose of it, it in fact gives us safety. It gives us something more meaningful. There's a story that a man was walking through a desert and saw a mountain. I believe that mountain symbolically is Mount Sinai. And he looks through a telescope or binoculars, and he sees people on both sides of the mountain carrying large stones up the mountain. And on the right side, he notices that as much as they carry, the people are complaining and they're sweating and they're unhappy. But on the other side of the mountain, people are carrying the same size stones, but instead of complaining, they're celebrating, they're singing, they've got smiles on their face. So he goes to the mountain and he understands that the people are complaining, that they're normal. Of course, if you have to carry rocks, heavy rocks, from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain, you're going to complain. But the people on the other side of the mountain who are smiling, who are singing, they must be out of their minds. They're crazy. What's wrong with them? So he goes over and he asks them, why are you so happy even though you're carrying these heavy rocks? He says, oh, you don't understand. On the other side of the mountain, they're carrying granite from the bottom to the top. It's very heavy, and it really doesn't serve much of a purpose. We're carrying gold. And even though gold is even heavier than granite, because we understand and appreciate the value of gold, it's not a burden to us. So if we understand in this parable the idea of mitzvahs, rather than being granite, being gold, being something precious, then it doesn't become a burden. It becomes a gift. And that's hinted in the word mitzvah, the commandments. Mitzvahs are good deeds. No, that's the classic translation. The word mitzvah means a commandment. But on an even deeper spiritual level, the word mitzvah is connected to the word tzavta or the word tsevet in modern Israeli Hebrew. Tsevet is used to mean a team or a crew of people who work together in unison. They're only a team if they all are connected in the same mission. So a mitzvah means also a connection. That when we do a mitzvah and understand that it is divinely commanded to us, not only we're doing good deeds for the world, but we are connecting to the one who gave us that commandment. God enclosed within the mitzvah His will and wisdom. This is the way it should be done. This is my understanding of why it's important. If God gave us mitzvahs that we didn't understand, like getting up every morning and chopping wood, if it was from God, it would connect us to God. It connects us to the giver. That's why when we say the blessing on reading the Torah, we say, for this mitzvah that you gave us, understanding that it came from God, and it creates that connection. And when we understand this spiritual mission, this connection of the Torah and mitzvahs and transformation of the world, we understand why when our sages translated the word Torah into the vernacular of the day when the Jews lived in Israel 2,000 years ago, Aramaic, they translated it into the word oraita. Oraita comes from the Hebrew word or, light. The Torah is not darkness. The Torah is light. Every mitzvah is an opportunity to be closer to God. Our sages say in the ethics of our fathers, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. One mitzvah brings another. They also tell us, schar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. What does that mean? Why don't we say the reward of the mitzvah is long life? The reward of the mitzvah is life in the world to come. We say the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah because what greater reward could a person want than to know that they're connected to God? Physical presence and rewards, they're fleeting. We come into this world with nothing, we leave with nothing. But we actually leave with all the good deeds that we did. No one can take those away from us. Not only they're remembered here on earth by the human population, but they carry us to a higher spiritual realm, connecting us now in a way that the soul understands through that mitzvah. There are a number of different customs for Shavuos. Many synagogues read the book of Ruth. Let's touch upon that and see how that connects to everything that we've been saying. Who was Ruth? Ruth was a non-Jew who followed her mother-in-law, Naomi, back to Israel and said, "Your God is my God, your way is my way. Wherever you go, I will go." Ruth was the classic example of a righteous convert to Judaism. Now, how do we know that she accepted the Torah? It's hinted in her name. When she chose the name Ruth, or Ruth in Hebrew, it's made up of 3 Hebrew letters. It's made of the letter Resh, the letter Vav, and the letter Taf. Each letter in Hebrew has a numerical value that corresponds to that letter. Aleph is 1, Beit is 2. So let's look at the letters in the word Ruth and see what they add up to. The Resh is 200, the Vav is 6, and the Taf is 400. Comes out to 606. That's not a coincidence. There's a lesson to be learned from that. Because prior to becoming Jewish, Ruth was already keeping 7 laws. These are known as the 7 universal laws given to the children of Noah, the Noahide laws. All mankind has the opportunity to serve God through following these commandments. They include not cursing and blaspheming against God or worshiping idols, not committing murder, not committing adultery, not stealing, setting up courts of law, not being cruel to animals to the point that you might even rip a limb off a living animal and eat it while you watch the animals suffer. Ruth was already keeping those 7 commandments as a righteous Gentile. And when she accepted the Torah, she understood that she was accepting an additional 606 commandments, which together with the 7 add up to 613. So the 606, which is her name Ruth, plus the 7 commandments she was already keeping, represented that she accepted that the 613 precepts, the commandments, the mitzvahs that are found in the Torah, both positive and negative. To give charity is a positive commandment. To not murder or to steal is a negative commandment. That's not a burden. That's a blessing in our society to not do those things. To rest and keep the Sabbath is a positive commandment. So Ruth represents that, and we read about her because in the same way that she accepted the Torah in her life, we were like converts at Mount Sinai, that we accepted the Torah. We accepted the mitzvahs. And through that we become connected. But we have to remember, keeping the Torah isn't just about ourselves and the Jewish people. The things that we do in Torah need to influence the world around us. Our neighbors, our non-Jewish neighbors. It's a mitzvah to be kind to them. It's a mitzvah to help them. This past Shabbos, as I was walking to synagogue, I saw a non-Jewish worker working at someone's house. And I smiled at him and I waved to him and I noticed that he looked very depressed. So I asked him if something's wrong. And he came over to me and he said, with his Spanish accent, that his heart was broken because he had just gone through a divorce. So I held his hand and I touched his heart and I said, God should heal you from the pain that you're experiencing. 3 hours later, when I returned from synagogue and passed that worker, he ran over to me again and thanked me for taking the time to speak to him in such a kind way. That's a mitzvah. That's what the Torah teaches us to do, in addition to putting on tefillin and keeping kosher and lighting Shabbat candles. Now there's another interesting event or custom that we celebrate on Shavuos that I want to mention. It happens to be one of my favorite, and that is having, instead of the traditional gefilte fish and meat or chicken meal, we have a dairy meal. Many people celebrate it by going out and getting a cheesecake and making kiddush on their grape juice or wine and having cheesecake, a dairy meal. What is that about? So many rabbis have given several explanations. One is that the word for milk, chalav, is numerically equal to 40. Ches is 8, Lamed is 30, Base is 2, add them up, and you get 40, representing the 40 days that Moses was on Mount Sinai. Again, that number of 40 being represented as transformation. Other people have explained that we have milk because the Jews wanted to slaughter animals, but they had just received the Torah with an understanding that they had to do a more clearly defined ritual slaughter, and they weren't sure how to do it completely yet. So they chose to have a dairy meal instead to avoid having to slaughter the animals. But I'd like to suggest something that I've thought a lot about and seen some sources about. Let's talk about what milk is. Milk gives life. It's what a mother shares with her infant child. It comes from the essence of the mother, and it's transmitted over to the child to give them life. The word for essence is atzmut. But what's interesting, what does milk actually nourish? The calcium in the milk nourishes our bones. And the word for bones, etzem, is the same letters as the word for essence, representing that in the same way that the physical milk comes from the mother to the child and nurtures his bones, God gives us from His essence the Torah, and it nurtures our essence being our soul. So we commemorate this by eating a dairy meal on the first day of Shavuos, and remembering that the whole experience of Sinai, the whole experience of getting the Torah, is to transform us, to help us transform the world, to make the world a better place, and to be a light unto the world and the nations, to show them that there is a God who gives moral ethics to the world that make the world a greater place. The very idea of freedom, that individuals should have their own rights after the Exodus of Egypt, came from the story found in our Torah. The world learnt it from that story that the Jews repeat over and over again on each Passover. In the same way, Shavuot should be a moment where we share the importance of godliness, the importance of making the world better, so that we not only affect ourselves, but we affect our neighbors, our family, and the world around us. And I want to give you a blessing that God should bless you with a wonderful, healthy, meaningful, and spiritual Shavuos as we receive the Torah, and receiving it should be done in the midst of great joy and great happiness. Thank you very much for joining us. And please remember, go to our website at www.jewsforjudaism.org, see our other webinars, see the many videos that have been put up that talk about a number of interesting Jewish topics, also concerning issues of the differences between Judaism and Christianity, and learn. Be a part of this exciting time in the history of Jewish people where the knowledge of Torah flows out to the world through the medium of the internet and Facebook and Twitter. And you know what? Right now we're taking questions via our Facebook message page. And you can send a question to us through our live stream chat, and I'll try my best to address your questions and give you an opportunity to learn more in depth. Thank you. Okay, so the first question I think I touched upon already, but I'm going to repeat it. The question is, what is the significance of God giving us the Torah in a desert? And why on Mount Sinai? So the significance here is the desert is a place that's void of water. And Torah is compared to water. Because the same way that water flows from a high place to a low place, so too the Torah, metaphorically speaking, descends from a higher spiritual realm down to this world. So the message of it being in the desert is that it is our job to bring the light and the holiness and the lessons of Torah even to a place that's a desert, that lacks Torah. We shouldn't think that because it lacks Torah we shouldn't go there. No, we should go there and we should influence and bring the messages of Torah to that place. And why it was given on Mount Sinai rather than any other mountain is, as I mentioned earlier, because it wasn't the highest mountain. It represented that even in the midst of this mission that we have to maintain our humility before God. So remember, you can send us other questions via Facebook, our Jews for Judaism Facebook page. And here's an interesting question. Of all of the many hundreds of commandments that are in the Torah, why did God choose the 10 that we speak about in the 10 commandments? Well, I believe that it's interesting that if you look at the 10 commandments, you'll see that the first 5 are commandments that are deeds between mankind and God. That we shouldn't worship idols, that we should believe in God, that we should keep the Sabbath holy. These commandments represent those commandments that are between the Jews and God. The other commandments, not to steal, not to commit murder, not to commit adultery, those are the commandments that are between man and our fellow human beings, teaching us that both types of commandments are equally important. It's not just about keeping Shabbat. It's about being honest in business. It's about not stealing and not hurting a person. And as long as I mentioned about the commandment of thou shalt not kill, I want to clarify that in Hebrew, there's a different word for killing and there's a different word for murder. Obviously, the Torah talks about that when a person threatens you or attacks you, you can defend yourself and even kill that person if it means saving your life or saving the life of another person. So there are extenuating circumstances where you are allowed to kill, but you're not allowed premeditative murder that lacks the sense of self-defense. So I think that these commandments represent these 2 different aspects of how we serve God. Also, if you count up the number of letters in the entire 10 commandments, it actually comes out to 620. Wow, where did we get 620? It seems it should have said 613, would have been perfect. But remember how earlier we talked about the 7 mitzvahs of Noah? There's another group of 7, and those are the commandments that the rabbis introduced to the Jewish tradition. And interestingly, Maimonides writes that when we do one of the rabbinical commandments, although we say a blessing that it was given by God, we are meant to remember that the reason we can say that is only because God in the Torah said that when you have questions or you have issues that you need to have clarified, go to the sages of those generations and ask them, and whatever they command you, you should do. And when the rabbis added the 7 commandments that serve to protect the integrity of the basic keeping of the Torah, that was something they understood was something that they did with an authority given to them by God. And those 7, along with the 613 commandments, add up to the number 620, which is the number of letters in the text of the 10 commandments. Interestingly, this idea that a commandment should be added on, and we need to clarify whether it's coming to God or because this human being was given the permission to create it, goes all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve. Just briefly, I'll point out, Adam and Eve were commanded not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But in fact, the only person that actually heard that command from God was Adam. Eve had not been created yet. But when she was tempted to eat the fruit, she said, God told us not to touch or eat from the tree. God never said not to touch it. So when she accidentally was pushed up against the tree, and she did touch it and she didn't die, she started to realize maybe this is not true. Where did she get the idea that you shouldn't touch it? This was something that Adam told her. God told Adam not to eat of the fruit. Adam took it upon himself to say, don't eat or touch it. The mistake he made is that he said it as if God had commanded both parts. What he should have said is, God told us not to eat of the fruit. And he empowered me to be a guardian over the garden. The same way the rabbis serve as a guardian over the Torah. Adam served as the guardian over the garden, and he said, God said not to eat it, but I'm telling you, don't even get close enough to touch it, because if you get that close, you might end up eating it. But because he didn't explain to Eve the details of how he was commanding that, rather directly from God, that created the problem. But it does show you, if done properly, it can serve as a very important mitzvah for fulfilling God's will of creating a fence around the Torah to protect us. We have another question. How can we know what the revelation at Sinai, that the revelation at Sinai really happened? What is the strength of this story? Well, you know, if you've ever played the game of telephone, where you're in a room with hundreds of people, and one person hands someone a message on a piece of paper, and they read it, and they whisper it in the ear of the person next to them. And then they whisper it in the ear of the person next to them, and it goes all the way around the room. By the time you get to the 200th person, the odds of the message coming out the same are almost nothing. We know that our parents received the story of the revelation of Sinai from their parents, who received it from their parents, all the way back for 3,300 years to Mount Sinai. And it's that tradition of being passed from generation to generation that gives us the force of belief, the truth of this. And not only that, it's not simply a tradition that one person had a revelation. It's a story of a national revelation. Additionally, another interesting factor that I found interesting is that we find Torah scrolls all over the world. We find them from different time periods. And in all the Torah scrolls that we have, with the possibility of there being so many inconsistencies and difference in the text, they are all the same. The only time they differ is in 2 cases where a certain Hebrew letter is changed, but it doesn't change a difference in the pronunciation or in the meaning of the word. But if you go into manuscripts, for example, of the New Testament, there's well over 1,000 different textual differences between these manuscripts. Not one, not 2, thousands of them. And that's from even a shorter period of transmission. I also think that we can look at the fact that the Torah says that if we trust in God, even though we are a small nation, not the most numerous of people, God will protect us. And if we look at the history of the Jewish people over the last 3,000 years, every nation that tried to destroy us, whether it was the Egyptians, or the Canaanites, or the Babylonians, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or the Turks, or the Russians, their empires fell and Judaism survived, not because we were the strongest, but because we had the Torah to hold us together. And that Torah, which is spoken of as a light to nations, gave morality to the world, is the foundation of the judicial system in England and the United States, which of all judicial systems in the world is the most fair that's humanly possible. So I think if you combine all of these reasons together, it becomes pretty clear that it would be pretty hard for someone to just simply make up a story that had such amazing results. Okay. Someone wrote in another question. They say, many Christians say that in the 5th book of the Bible, Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 15, where it says, "And you shall watch yourself very well, for you did not see any image on that day that the Lord spoke to you at Mount Sinai from the midst of the fire." But they say that it simply means that you didn't see a carved image and that we shouldn't have carved idols. How do we explain the correct translation? That's the explanation of this passage. What does it really mean? Well, obviously Jews say it means much more than simply making a carved image. It means that God does not have any form or shape. And the minute we relegate God to have some type of limited form or shape or parts, that becomes idolatry. And it's interesting, if you read the complete passages in Deuteronomy, it says not only we didn't see an image of God, not like anything in the heaven or the earth, anything spiritual that we could imagine that might have some form or physical on this earth, or even under the water, something that's usually hidden from us. And when we combine with that with other passages in the Torah that say that God is the beginning and God is the end, He is the first and He is the last, and beside Him there is no other, as it says in Isaiah, or as when Moses was approached by God and Moses says, "What name should I tell the Jewish people to identify you?" God's answer was, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh," I will be what I will be, taking the Hebrew verb for to be and combining it into the 3 tenses of past, present, and future, that God transcends time and space. So when we see and understand all of those passages together, we see that the statement that you should not envision that God had any shape or form represents not having a God in our understanding that is anything less than an absolute unity that transcends any limitations of time and space, and also throws out the possibility of God coming and dwelling in a physical body or being defined as being 3 parts. Another question. I think I just answered it. This question how does Jewish belief in the oneness of God differ from other faiths? Well, primarily, it's interesting, Muslims' belief in one God is much similar to Jews. They do not believe in a Trinity. And Judaism differs from Christianity, probably as much as Christianity differs from the Mormons. For many Christians, the idea of a Trinity is that God exists in His essence as 3 different divine parts: Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But that's how God exists in His essence. We speak about how God exists in His essence, transcends time and space, no limitations. The minute you start saying that it's 1 part or 2 part, you've limited one of them. And only something that's within time and space can be limited. So our understanding of the oneness of God is an absolutely pure, unadulterated oneness that does not have any kind of shape, form, limitations, or existing within time and space. And that, in fact, allows us to be even closer to God than having a physical form or a concept in our mind of what God is like. Because being so transcending time and form, God is everywhere and is easily accessible to us at any moment that we so desire. Let's see if there are any more questions. We have a few more minutes, so if you want to type in your question on the Facebook message, please do so. Well, so since that is... Okay, one last question. Can you explain the difference between any of the rules and commandments that Jews were given before Mount Sinai or after Mount Sinai? I think that's the question. Well, the commandments that were given before Mount Sinai, like we talked about the 7 commandments from the time of Noah, the difference was that they didn't transform the world spiritually and reveal the godliness. They transformed the person into a better person. They guided the person in a better way. But once Mount Sinai was given, where godliness descended down to earth, and we reached up into the heavens as Moses went on Mount Sinai, there was that intermingling, and God empowered us that when we do a mitzvah now, we're able to actually transform the physical world into something more spiritual, with more revelation. That did not occur to before Mount Sinai. In fact, that's why, even though we were given certain commandments prior to Mount Sinai, we don't keep them because of that. We keep them because of they were re-given at Mount Sinai, and now we're on a higher level and had a greater ability to transform the world. So I thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll join us next month for our next webinar. And please, if you are interested in learning with the rabbis of Jews for Judaism, please contact our offices, whether it's here in Los Angeles, whether it's in our Toronto office, our Sydney, Australia office, or our Baltimore office. We are here to learn and to study. We're here to counsel someone who might be confused because they've had an encounter with a cult or an evangelical Christian group that is confusing them with passages that they don't understand. We're here to educate through our lectures and our programs, to teach people to use their critical thinking skills in a way that empowers them to deal with the different life issues that confront them. And most of all, if you're in a position to help us by supporting our important work, we would really appreciate if you went to jewsforjudaism.org/support. That's jewsforjudaism.org/support. And make a contribution, a tax-deductible contribution. Help us rescue the Jewish college student who's been converted by a missionary. Help us counsel the parent who is in pain over the loss of their child to a cult group. Help us go into schools and to youth groups of all denominations and educate children and give them a sense of pride in their identity so that they can go and share it with their peers and when they do get married with their families. That's the mission of Jews for Judaism, keeping Jews Jewish. And by joining us as a supporter, you fulfill the slogan that together we can keep Jews Jewish. Thank you and good evening.